note that this will be very likely the most complicated information that we'll do all year, right? So, but I'm going to try to, I'm trying not to get into the weeds too much. We'll get into the weeds a little bit on Daniel and particularly talking about the empires and such. But really on the rest of it, I didn't want to get into the weeds so much. And listen, just so you don't think I'm saying, well, you wouldn't understand or so. Listen, for the last 2 weeks, it's all I've studied, okay? And I never could, like I was telling somebody else, when it's about the temple and all of that. Now listen, I have an opinion, and I'll tell you what my opinion is. But if I had to defend in a debate my opinion, I don't know that I could do that fully to where it would be believable. But listen, I don't know that anybody can do that. And I think that's the point of all three of these passages. I'm a little more, I would argue a little more on the empires, which is where we're going to spend a little more time. I would argue a little more confidently on that. But even then, these are things that you can't be dogmatic on, okay? So people that are really confident about these things that we're going to talk about today, and they say, well, it's just obvious, and this, that, and the other, and the Bible interprets itself, and all those, those little catchphrases, that's just not the case. And you can read, I have, on each book, so like on Ezekiel, I've probably got 100 commentaries, and I could literally read every commentary, and it would have at least some of the details would be different, right? And that's just the nature of these types of passages where they're extremely complicated, and we live, in this case, 2,600 years away from their original context, right? And so scholars will do the best they can. They will come up with their opinions, and they're educated opinions, right? But it's still, scholars are not going to be dogmatic about it. The more dogmatic a person is about this stuff, probably the more wrong they are, right? So I would argue that. So also, with that said, note that, and I know they were over here looking, please, when are we getting to the new? We're going to be in the New Testament on the 24th, okay? So we will finally be in the New Testament. But even then, let me just say, and listen, the New Testament will be, well, I say it's going to be a lot easier, particularly the Gospels. We'll at least be in the Gospels for a little while. So the Gospels will be a little easier to at least explain the parts, right? And so, but the problem is there will be so many parts every week. So it's still kind of the same thing. This whole thing is like drinking from a fire hose. So, yeah, I mean, it's crazy stuff. And so it's going to be a little bit like that tonight. Again, there's not going to be a test. And so, listen, whatever you can get from it. And then otherwise, you'll just be, if you can take anything away from tonight and be like somewhat, know somewhat more than you did when you came in, then I'll have done my job at least somewhat decently. All right, so again, and on this first one, we're not going to read any of it. So don't worry about trying to turn to it or whatever, unless you want to skim through it as we talk about it. But Ezekiel 40 through 48, I just want to talk about that for a minute because that is important, because a lot of people will interpret that as a literal temple that's going to be rebuilt before Jesus can return, right? So they'll ultimately take it from the Old Testament context, and they'll say, well, it's all future. And then they'll say, well, the temple has to be rebuilt before Jesus returns. And I caution you on that, and we'll talk about why. But note that if the temple is rebuilt, the purpose of a rebuilt temple would be to reinstitute the sacrificial system, right? Which we kind of talked about a little bit beforehand. And if we are saying that it's required that a temple is to be rebuilt before Jesus can return, then what we're saying is that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was not sufficient for at least some people, for whatever people, whether it be the Jewish people or whoever it may be, because then the sacrificial system has to be there. And then some people will argue a caveat. They'll say, well, it's not because it has to be, because it's for salvation or anything. They'll say it's as a reminder of Jesus' sacrifice and things like that. Well, listen, I mean, if you want a reminder about what you've been saved from as far as the law, then we have the book. right? You can go through and read it, and we have read it. Feel free to read it over and over and over again because it is quite enthralling. But you could do that, right? You can read it and you know already. So to have a literal temple that reinstitutes a sacrificial system, I just don't see a reason for that. And again, that's not my only argument. That it's my feelings are. It's not just about my feelings. Note that the point of this whole temple vision and everything in Ezekiel is that the temple and the return of the glory of the Lord present a reversal of when Ezekiel saw the glory of the Lord leave and the temple destroyed, right? And all of this is in the context of God is going to allow his people to come back, right? And now listen, the problem is it presents quite an idealized version of the temple, right? Where everything runs smoothly and perfectly and everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. And obviously we know that never happened, right? And so that's where people will get caught up. And I get that. And they'll say, well, clearly it's not talking about anything to do with back then because that never happened. I would argue again that it's more the ideal of it, the idea that they're going to get to come back. They have the opportunity for things to go back to or not back to a perfect state, but to a perfect state. And then that's just never realized, right? But the opportunity was still there. You could certainly make that argument. But here are the views on the temple, right? And I am not dismissing any of those views as far as, like I said, I know a lot of people, I disagree with it. I know a lot of people think there's got to be a future temple. I disagree with that, but I'm not dismissing that because, again, you can certainly interpret it that way. And I think we have to be very careful in today's, modern debate because, look, we watch politics and stuff, and you can't disagree with somebody anymore, right? You can't say, well, I hear what you're saying. I disagree with it because this, that, and the other thing, but you know what? We're okay. You cannot say that anymore. It has to be, I disagree with you, you're an idiot, therefore I hate you and you're evil. Like literally that's the state of our modern political discourse, right? And so we don't want to be that way with things like this. And you do see that sometimes where people are like, well, you're not a Christian or you don't believe the Bible. That's the worst, right? Well, you don't believe what the Bible says. Well, I mean, some of it's up for interpretation, right? All right, so views on the temple. The building of the first view, the building of the temple will literally occur in Israel's future, right? And so again, that will be, you could argue that that's still future yet and that there will be a temple. Note, what would be the biggest right now, and listen, I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but what would be the biggest stumbling block for building the temple today on the Temple Mount? Does anybody know? It's where the Dome of the Rock is, right? It's where the holiest site of Islam is, right? And so, note that that's been an issue for a long time, and it's so bad that I was watching a video. We may have watched it in a Bible Lit class one year, but so when they do archaeology, they're like, you want to get underneath the temple, right, where the temple was, and there's all kinds of caves and stuff underneath there, and you could do that, but those who are in control of the mount, the Temple Mount right now, they will not allow that. And so what they do is they go through and they just trash all that stuff. They'll go in and just throw it all out. And so archaeologists have to stay outside the city where it's all dumped, and then they have to go through the trash dump, basically. I mean, it's not literally like you go down the road here and there's a trash dump, but it's like they just dump it out. And so pot shards and pottery and stuff like that, which is very important to archaeology, that stuff is all broken. If there was anything that wasn't broken, there's just all kinds of, it's just a bad situation. And so that would be an obvious issue. And I'm not saying that couldn't ever change, but that's obviously a big deal. So the second view is that the building of that temple would have occurred in Israel's future, but they lost out due to disobedience, right? So it could have been that idealized temple, but since they still didn't obey after they moved back into the land, they didn't get that opportunity, right? And I would just argue on that one, just to be honest, that is an attractive view, but I don't know how the expectation would have been that it could have ever been. Like, thinking humans are going to do that and you couldn't do it after Jesus. I mean, I just don't see how that could have been. Again, you could say that they were presented with the possibility, like this is what it would be like if you guys would do what you're supposed to do. But I don't know that the expectation could have possibly been ever that they're going to definitely do what they're supposed to do. The third view is that it will come about during the millennial kingdom on earth at Christ's return, right? So that temple would be rebuilt at Christ's return. But again, at that point, it's a sacrificial system, and I don't know that needs. But again, some would argue that it's just symbolic to show that, whatever, and I don't know, I don't see that. The fourth view is that it is fulfilled figuratively in the church body itself. The church body is the temple, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the fifth view is that it is fulfilled in the new heavens and the new earth described in Revelation 21 and 22. I'm just going to go ahead and say, and I'm not saying I'm right, but I would argue probably more, and again, I wouldn't be dogmatic, that it is fulfilled figuratively in the church, okay? And why do I say that? Well, Paul speaks of the temple being made up of believers in 1 Corinthians, first at 3:16 through 17. He says, "Do you know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple." Right? 1 Corinthians 6:19, he says, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own." And then he goes on to talk about other stuff. Note that Revelation also speaks of the temple as being made up of believers, right? And so then you get to Revelation, which is a apocalyptic book, right? Where it's talking about in symbolic language. But notice at 3:12 it says, "The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name." And so note there in Revelation, at least in chapter 3, we're talking about believers make up the temple, and this is the body of believers, in this case, makes up the new temple. And then it also alludes in the book of Revelation to the non-literal nature of a future temple at Revelation 21:22, where it says, "And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb," right? So there it's referring to God and the Lamb. So God, again, throughout the book of Revelation, you have the Father or God set up in different places, and then you have Jesus set up in the exact same way. And the clear point there is that Jesus is God, right? And so you get that throughout. So when it talks about the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb, again, clearly the book has made clear that they're the same. And so again, there's a whole body of literature about Jesus himself as the temple, and fulfilling the temple and all of that. And so again, my instincts are that this temple is not literal, right? And so, and it seems to be that Paul understands it that way, and Revelation clearly understands it that way. But again, Revelation is symbolic, so there could be some room for argument there. All right, so that's what we're going to deal with on the temple. Again, I wouldn't be dogmatic about any of those. Very quickly.
There's so many details about.
Yes, and that's the other issue. And yeah, it's a great question. Why are there so many details and stuff? And that is an issue. But note, too, that you also have in Revelation where it measures out the temple and all these different places. But there, the point is it's clearly measuring out the body of believers, which it then seems to be saying is the temple itself. But yes, so I think there in Ezekiel, when it goes through all of those details, it does seem to be presenting an idealized view of what the temple would be like. I guess you could argue this, and so then you could say, because that's a good point, you could say that it's maybe a mixture of two of the views, of view 2 and maybe view 4, where you could say, okay, just like in the Old Testament where several things were supposed to happen that never happened, because the Jewish people didn't do what they were supposed to do, that were then fulfilled in Jesus. And so you could say that the idealized view of the temple is what it could have been like if people did what they were supposed to do. They didn't do that. So then you have Jesus, and then it's fulfilled through Jesus and the New Testament church. So you could kind of combine those two and say this is what you could have, but since then ultimately in the 2020 hindsight we don't have that, so therefore it's ultimately fulfilled in the New Testament period. Something like that maybe. Does that make sense? Does that kind of answer that question? But yes, there are many details, and so that could certainly lend itself to there will be a literal temple. But note too that in those details it is clearly a sacrificial system. It is not just a symbolic deal if you take it as this is going to be a literal temple that's rebuilt. And so at that point, I would say if we say that it's future and that it's still future yet, then I would say we run into a problem where again, why do we need a temple and sacrificial system if we have Jesus, right? And so that would be, yeah. So, and again, that's why this is so complicated. Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that this is entirely a Jewish thing, and the Gentile part of this is completely left out. That this temple business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the Jewish people would want a temple, and note too that their temple is destroyed, and they want their temple back, right?
I understand that.
Yeah.
But
in the New Testament, I would think it's not.
Emphasis on the temple seems to me is just it's oriented toward the Jew.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it would absolutely be, yeah. Yeah, and then once you get to the New Testament, I mean, again, it's all symbolic, and talking about a temple is all believers and Jesus and different things. Yeah. But I think that is the difference between the fulfillment of the law and what the temple represented, which was the law, and then what Jesus represents as the fulfillment of the law. Right.
Yeah,
I agree.
In Revelations, where you see the New Jerusalem coming down.
Yeah.
Of course they'll have a temple.
Well, again, though, you have to think of that as also it's very symbolic, right? Yeah, right. I'm with you. I agree. I'm just saying. Listen, I'm just saying it's not simple, right? I mean, it's not a simple thing. Like I said, I mean, I agree that the level of detail, somebody would say, well, clearly they seem to be, but I would just say that's the hope for the new temple that's going to be built. But that new temple is not spectacular, right? It's just not spectacular. It's not anything like Solomon's temple, right? And so that would be, that's the problem that people have. They'll say, okay, like you could easily say this is going to be, they're just talking about the temple that's going to be rebuilt under Ezra, Nehemiah and all that, right? But then you see that temple, and then in hindsight, you look at it and you say, that doesn't seem like this description, right? So therefore, it must be talking about something different. And so then what different is it talking about? Is it actually talking about a temple that still has yet to be rebuilt? Because we hadn't seen that one yet. Or is it some sort of symbolic deal or an ideal of what the temple should be like and could be like if everybody did what they were supposed to do? And I would argue that. I would argue it's probably an ideal, but then fulfilled ultimately in the church itself. So I would say that.
These are visions.
Yeah.
These guys are having.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. We're not going to go into any detail about it because it's really not necessary. But just note that Jehoiachin is released from prison, okay, in 2 Kings 25, 27 through 30, and Jeremiah 52, 31 through 34. Remember, he was taken off, right? And so he's released, and what this does is it provides hope for the survival of the Davidic line, right? So when we see Jehoiachin released from prison, then we see, the Davidic line still has a chance to continue on. That's the point of that. And note that Zerubbabel, who was the governor when the temple, when we're going to rebuild the temple, that's Jehoiachin's grandson, right? And so you have that line continuing on. And so it's not squashed out through the destroying of Jerusalem and all of that. All right, now we get to the apocalyptic section of Daniel, which is Daniel 7 through 12. Of course, we don't do all of that tonight. Note that the first 6 chapters of Daniel deal with what we call the court narratives, and then chapters 7 through 12 deal with the apocalyptic visions, right? So you have to remember that a hallmark of apocalyptic literature is that it is symbolic, right? It is highly symbolic. And what you have is you generally have an angel who is there and who is explaining the symbols. And again, let me point out, this is written to people who lived in Daniel's time. Those people would have understood what all this stuff means, okay? This is not information that only people in modern times will understand, right? It would have made no sense for Daniel to write a book and then it be read by all these Jewish people and they'd be like, oh, this has nothing to do with us. This is only for people that live 2,000 years from now, right? That's just not the way the Bible works, right? It's written to those people for a purpose. Listen, God doesn't owe us anything, right? And so if it was stuff that only had to do with us today, God would have just left it out, right? Because he doesn't owe us any answers. If you think this is written for us today, like it has nothing to do with them, then it's really confusing because you could have done a better job because it's extremely complicated, right? And so if it was only written for us today and it was only about things today, then maybe it could have been written in a little clearer manner, right? But it obviously wasn't. What is the point of apocalyptic literature? The point of apocalyptic literature is to say, you are living under this evil empire, okay? It seems like God has been defeated and that God's not going to help you anymore or whatever, but that's not the case. God is still in control, and in the end, God is going to judge all evil, and the righteous are going to be rewarded. That is the whole point of apocalyptic literature, okay? So when you read this apocalyptic part of Daniel, that's the point that he's making. And of course, Daniel is in exile under Babylon and then Persia. And so that's why you have an apocalyptic part of Daniel, is because he's living under the empire. And that empire being Babylon and Persia. And so the point is, listen, guys, it seems like all is lost and that the gods of the Babylonians and the Persians or whatever have won out. Our God is not, he's been defeated or he doesn't care about us anymore or whatever it is. And apocalyptic literature is a message of hope saying that is not the case and that God is going to take care of things in the end. Okay, now there's a lot of detail and stuff in there, but that's the basic point, right? If you go into apocalyptic literature with that in mind, then just that little bit of information will help you understand much better. That's what the book of Revelation is about. That is literally the entire book of Revelation, okay? It is about, I know that Rome is trying to get you to worship the emperor, and they're trying to get you to join trade guilds and stuff so that you can get work, but you're going to sacrifice your everlasting life, your eternal soul, for the comfort that you find in the empire. Do not do that. Do not look for comfort in the empire. Look for comfort in God, through Christ in the New Testament, of course, who offers you everlasting comfort, right? That's the whole point. Don't trade your comfort for your everlasting soul for comfort here on earth. Okay. Daniel's 4 beasts of chapter 7. Note that chapter 7 describes Daniel's vision of evil world empires, the enthronement of the human divine Messiah, and the judgment of those evil world empires, right? So again, you have the evil world empires being evil, you have the enthronement of the human divine Messiah, and you have the judgment of evil world empires, right? Those world empires. And this is a huge debate, okay, about what these 4 empires represent. And I know, listen, some of you are going to think when you get done, I don't really care, one way or the other. It really does not matter to me. I am not going to lose sleep either way. But these are highly debated things, and I just want you to be familiar with the debates and why they're even there in the first place. So the first view is the Roman view. Okay, you got 4 empires, right? The first view is the Roman view. That just means that Rome is the last empire, right? And so in that case, you would say that Babylon is the first empire, Medo-Persia is the second. Medo means Media, which is a place It's north of Persia, okay? So it would be, if you're looking at a map and you have like a Turkey that comes out over here, which is Asia Minor, so Media is back over here, and then Persia is going to be down in this area. So Media is north of Persia, right? So Medo-Persia together, Greece, and then Rome, okay? So Babylon, Media, and Persia together, Greece, and Rome. The Greek view, which of course means Greece is the last empire, Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece. So they split Media and Persia, and then Greece is the last empire discussed in the book of Daniel, and Rome is not discussed. Okay. Then you have the symbolic view, and I will just go ahead and say that I ultimately agree with the symbolic view that the ultimate point of all of this is that world empires will come and they will go, but God is going to judge evil and reward the righteous. That is the ultimate point here. However, I do think that the four empires in Daniel do specifically point to empires, whereas the symbolic view will say they don't point to any empires. They're just saying they represent all empires over time, right? But I do think that they actually have real empires in mind, or Daniel has real empires in mind. All right, Daniel 7, 1 through 4. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, right? So note, sea equals chaos. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. So note that the stirring of the great sea is ominous. So as you read this, as a Jewish person who believes that the sea is chaos and that you don't want to get too far into that because there's scary stuff there, and let me just point out there is scary stuff in there. And again, they believed that that the sea was represented by sea monsters, right? And so again, the biblical version of that would be Leviathan, Ugarit, which is north of Israel. They called it Lotan. In Babylon, that sea creature that represented the chaos seas was called Tiamat. And in Canaanite, which is the land of Canaan, it was Tannin, right? So they all had a name for this chaos seas that were represented by a sea monster, right? So again, that's just the way they looked at it. So it would be very ominous for this to for these sea creatures. Note that the beast would be seen as these sea creatures, right? Again, it's symbolic, right? It's not literal that they literally are sea creatures, but they're represented that way. And so when we talk about the four beasts, they're coming up out of the sea and all of that, they would be seen as at least allied. Now, obviously, they're described as bears and all those things, but in the back of your mind, you would be thinking, chaos, sea creatures, okay? Note that Jeremiah describes Nebuchadnezzar as a lion and an eagle in Jeremiah 49, 19 through 22. Again, we don't need to read that. So just note that the first beast is definitely Babylon. Okay, in other words, all scholars almost, except for those who say it's just all symbolic, they will argue that it's clearly Babylon. And it'll go through a little more detail here in a minute. So at 7:5, and behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. So that's important. It's raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. Okay, so note the second beast is either Medo-Persia, together, those two empires, or just Media, right? So those who argue that the second beast is the Medo-Persia Empire, or the Medo-Persian Empire, will argue that Media wasn't powerful enough on its own to be considered an empire that was worthy of being one of these beasts. So the raised side of the bear represents the power of Persia over Media. So it's a lopsided bear because the one side is Persia and the other side is Media, Media being the lesser side. Those who argue that the second beast is Media provide several examples from ancient historians where the empire order is given Babylon and Assyria as the same, right? So Babylon, they see, basically because they have the same landmass, they'll say, well, Assyria and Babylon are the same thing, right? And so basically Babylon. We'll just say Babylon's first, Media, Persia, and Greece. And we have that through several, at least 5 that I found, examples in ancient literature that have that order. And then sometimes they even add Rome as the 5th empire, right? And so again, clearly, there are people who understood it that way. That Media and Persia were 2 separate empires. Additionally, in Daniel 2:39, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that the second kingdom will arise, because note that the 4 empires back there in chapter 2, they're the same, right? They're the same empires. That the second kingdom will arise after you. Well, after Nebuchadnezzar, you had several Babylonian emperors. And so if it's after Nebuchadnezzar, then it would seem that that second beast rises up to power while Babylon is still a thing, right? And it turns out from history that we do have examples where they talk about Media being an empire stronger than Babylon while Babylon is still an empire, a world leader, right? And so, again, you have that. In that case, when the bear is risen up on one side, they would say that it's ready to pounce, right? And so they would say that's what it's going to, swipe, if you will. The 3 ribs symbolize the insatiable appetite of the empire to devour other nations. And some will name them as 3 major conquests by either, and listen, if you take the Media-Persia view, then there are 3 that they will point out. And if you take the Media alone view, there are 3 that they will point out. And so those 3 ribs probably are 3 major places that were defeated. And so it just shows you how scary they are because they defeated these places. For Medo-Persia, it's Lydia, Babylonia, and Egypt. And for Media, it's Urartu, Manea, and the Scythians. Okay, so just in case you wanted to know that. I know you are like, please tell us what the 3 empires are. Daniel 7:6, after this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Note that the description of the beast symbolizes its speed and ferocity, right? So all of the wings, and it's like a leopard, it's just saying it just goes quickly through and destroys everything, right? So the beast this beast in the Roman view is Greece. The 4 heads would be the 4 kings who split Alexander's empire, right? And then in the Greek view, it's Persia, and it also represents 4 kings, right? So then we get to Daniel 7:7-8. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. Notice it's just a beast. It doesn't have a description, right? Or it doesn't have what type of animal it is. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. That's important later on. And it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Okay? Note that in the Roman view, this of course is Rome. The 10 horns would represent 10 kings, and the little horn represents a future Antichrist figure only, right? So they don't have a specific king. It's only a future Antichrist figure, or at least as far as I got through. In the Greek view, this is Greece. And the 10 horns represent the 10 independent states that rise up after Alexander the Great and after the 4 kings. The little horn represents very specifically Antiochus IV from about 200 years before Jesus. Note that horns represent power or kings in apocalyptic literature. The vast majority of early Jewish and Christian interpreters interpret the fourth beast as Rome. And that's one reason why people are so they want to stick with that, right? Because you say, well, throughout history, that's been the interpretation. The problem is that those interpreters all lived under Rome, right? So they were biased toward Rome because they lived under Roman rule, right? And so they're like, well, this beast has to be Rome because they're so ferocious and horrible, right? So that became the traditional view, right? Traditional. Generally, we say traditional view is the conservative view, right? And that's been the way it's been looked at. The Greek view has also unfortunately been associated with those who deny predictive prophecy in the past, right? So what that means is a lot of your earlier scholars and many of your scholars today who hold the view that the last empire is Greece, they will say, well, there's no such thing as predictive prophecy, right? People can't predict the future, right? They don't see the future. God doesn't give people the future. So therefore, the book of Daniel was not written in 586 to 539 or whatever. It was actually written after all of these events happened, and it makes it look like it was written before the case, right? And so obviously that's a non-starter, right? You can't, as a Christian or a Jewish person even, you can't look at that and say, well, it's just because that right there is a lie, right? I mean, in other words, that would be a little kind of messed up. But note that view has changed in recent years, and there are many conservative scholars today who will argue that the last one is Greece and still believe in predictive prophecy, right? And let me just tell you, I would be one. I'm not a scholar. I'm just saying I agree with those scholars that the last one is Greece. I do believe that the little horn is Antiochus IV, and we'll talk about why. And I do believe that it was written before the events happened, and I believe that God can give people, tell them what the future is going to look like. Note that the little horn in chapter 8, so we just talked about the little horn in this final empire, right? The little horn in chapter 8 is clearly associated with Greece, right? It clearly says that the little horn is with Greece. You would have to dissociate the two little horns and say that they're not the same thing, right? Note, interestingly, that Hosea states that Yahweh threatens to fight against his people as a lion, a leopard, a bear, and an unidentified fourth beast, which would line up not in the same order, but in the same categories. At Hosea 13, 7 through 8, it says, "So I am to them like a lion, like a leopard I will lurk beside the way. I will fall upon them like a bear robbed of her cubs. I will tear open their breast, and there I will devour them like a lion, as a wild beast," so the wild beast would be the unidentified fourth beast, "would rip them open," right? So again, it's a similar idea. Not saying that they're necessarily related, but it is a similar idea. Okay, and then you get to Daniel 7, 9 through 14, okay? All right, and so what we're going to do again, we'll just read it. At 7, 9 through 14, it says, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire." Notice again, this is God's flaming throne chariot. "A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened." Again, this is the divine counsel of God. "I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed," right? So that's the little horn again speaking. "And its body was destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." And look, very quickly again, you see the evil empires that are dominating God's people at the moment, right? And then boom, you get a picture of God's everlasting kingdom ruled over by this mysterious Son of Man, right? And that's an everlasting kingdom that will never fall. And so again, the point is, put your faith in that. Don't put your faith in the empire to provide comfort. And we've talked about this in the past. Again, who rides on the clouds? God's ride on the clouds, right? And so the Old Testament clearly depicts Yahweh as the rider on the clouds. Psalm 68:4 says, "Sing to God, sing praises to his name, lift up a song to him who rides through the deserts." He's riding on the clouds is the way they would have seen that. His name is the Lord, exult before him. Psalm 104:3 is more specific. It says, "He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind," right? And so note that in Ugaritic mythology, it is El who is the head of the gods, and Baal is his regent. And Baal is the rider on the clouds, right? Here, you have Yahweh, who is also called El in the Old Testament. He is the head over the other divine beings in his council, and the cloud rider is also his regent, right? And it is indeed Yahweh, as we just talked about, who is riding on the clouds here, but in another form, in the form of Jesus, right? And so his cloud rider is technically himself. It is God riding on the clouds, but in the form of Jesus, who will come and make all of this everlasting kingdom possible, right? Everyone who read this or heard this in the ancient world would have understood that this is a divine being. And again, that's why when Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, they always, called him for blasphemy, because they clearly understood that he was claiming to be this God riding in on the clouds, right? And so that would have been an issue for them. 7:15 through 18. "As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever." Again, you have 4 great kingdoms. Don't give in to them, because the saints will get an everlasting kingdom, right? And so again, that's the whole point of apocalyptic literature. So the point here is that earthly kingdoms will come and go. The kingdom of God is eternal. Put your faith in the everlasting kingdom, right? So then you get to 19. "Then I desired to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest." So again, you've got that language about it was different than all the rest. "Exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet." So note that the 4th beast is different than the other 3. Greece was a Western empire, right? It was not one of the Semitic speaking groups, right? And so it was different than all the rest. If it's Greece and then Rome, Greece and Rome were not really that different, right? Except for the fact, and in addition to, Greece spread their culture everywhere they went, right? And so again, that's a way that they were different than other places. And so again, I would argue Greece is the 4th empire. 7:20, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell. So you've got 10 horns, the one that came up, which is the 11th, just for the record, and before which 3 of them fell. The horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things and that seemed greater than its companions. This is all negative language, right? He's speaking negative, blasphemous things. So the 10 horns could indicate the 10 independent states that arose after Alexander in Greece, right? And so I know you want to know what they are. They're Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucia, Macedon, Pergamum, Pontus, Bithynia, Cappadocia, Armenia, Parthia, and Bactria. All right, there's your 10. The other horn, or little horn, is most likely Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He was 4th in line to be king after his father. He had 3 brothers that should have been king before him, and they all ended up dead. And so he killed at least one of them, but the other 2, it seems they were killed other ways. But he ends up taking the kingdom, and so therefore he's over 3 of them. He took over 3 of them. 21 through 25. "As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as the fourth beast there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. Note again, this is all symbolic language. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, again, those kingdoms, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times in the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time, right? So note that from 167 to 164 BC, which is the time, times, and half a time, Antiochus outlawed all Jewish religious practice and sent out soldiers to kill anyone who refused to obey. He also plundered the temple and turned it into a pagan shrine, and he sacrificed a pig, which of course is an unclean animal, on the altar. This is what is the word? Desolation. What is it? How does it say? The abomination of desolation, right? Or that leads to desolation, right? That's what it's talking about. And note that this is all remedied by, and when it talks about that things will get better and everything, this is remedied when the Maccabean revolution happens. And you don't know about that unless you read in the Apocrypha from 1st and 2nd Maccabees, right? And it's actually very fascinating. That's where Hanukkah comes from. When Antiochus, when the Maccabeans revolted against Antiochus IV and his soldiers, they ended up defeating them because he was fighting too many wars on too many fronts. So they defeated him, and they went in and they cleansed the temple. That's what Hanukkah celebrates every year, is that re-cleansing of the temple during the Maccabean revolution, right? That's what Hanukkah is. And again, Hanukkah is not in the Bible because it happened in between the testaments, and it's you don't get that in the law, right? All right, and I'm actually, again, I'm just going to say that the ultimate message here, no matter which view you take, is that evil empires will come and go, right? Though it may seem like God is not in control because of the evil, he is still in control and will judge all evil kingdoms and set up his eternal kingdom, no matter what the 4 empires represent, right? But then we get to the ram and the goat of Daniel 8. And we're going to look at starting at 8:17. It says, so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end, right? And so then you say, well, Joe, this says that it's of the time of the end. Well, yeah, but it could just be the time of the end of the events that are being talked about, which would be the end of Antiochus IV, right? At 20 through 21, 8:20 through 21. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece, which is the last empire that's always talked about everywhere in Daniel. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king, which is Alexander the Great. Okay? As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And this is going to be the 4 kings, the 4 generals who end up splitting up the kingdom of Alexander the Great. And that's Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, right? And so that's the 4 kings if you take the Greek view, which I do. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, right, which is the end of their kingdom. So we're talking about the end of their kingdom, right, which is Greece. A king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. Antiochus IV. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. And again, I would argue that the king here is Antiochus IV. Note that Michael in chapter 10, which is this week's readings, is described as the Prince of Israel. So he's the leader of God's armies. And note that the last kingdom he's going to fight is Greece again. So the meaning here would be that Antiochus believes that he can beat God and his armies. Note again that this passage points to Greece as the climactic empire of the chapter. So Greece seems to be in view in the book as the last of the four empires again. Okay, so there's your empires. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, we're not going to spend nearly as much time in Daniel's 70 weeks. Again, this is extremely complicated stuff. I did go through it many different ways, and because it deals with Jubilee years and all kinds of, like I just, there was no chance that I was going to do all this stuff. And again, I wasn't able to wrap my mind around it enough to even try to explain it in such a way that y'all wouldn't all just get up and walk out. So
This statement here at the end of verse 26, it refers to many days in the future.
yeah, that would be
The,
400 and something days. Yeah, yeah.
or 400 and something years.
I mean years. I'm sorry, years. Yep. All right, but you could obviously argue also that it means 4,000 years, right? So so either way on that, you could argue it's either way in the future, 400 years or whatever, or way.
This fits so well in the 400 and something years.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. All right, Daniel 70 weeks. Note that this is one of the most debated passages in all of the Bible, right? So again, we're not going to like iron out an answer here and be like, this is it, silver bullet, right? But note that Daniel prays for the end of the 70 years that are described in Jeremiah, right? Because Jeremiah is promised that there will be 70 years and then people will be able to go back. Daniel 9:2 says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. And then he gets this answer later on from Gabriel. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. So now it's 70 weeks, right? So it's 77s to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both visions and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place, right? I'm going to go ahead and tell you that in the Greek view, this makes complete sense because you're going to end at the anointing of the most holy place, which is going to be the cleansing of the temple after Antiochus IV in Jerusalem, right? Note he is then told that the end of the 7 years in this passage, he is told that the end of the 7 years is actually part of a greater 70 weeks. So it's like, are we there yet? Like, it's going to take us two hours to get there, right? And then you get to the end of the 2 hours, it's like 15 minutes left, and you're like, all right, are we there yet? No, I'm sorry. The 2 hours is simply part of a longer 24-hour trip that we have to take. That's pretty much what he's being told, right? Where there will be a new devastation, right? And so he's looking forward to the end of all this bad stuff, and he's being told now, no, there's going to be even worse stuff that's going to happen on down the road. The abomination that causes desolation, right? Which again, I would argue for the Greek view, that is the temple being profaned. Leviticus 26 describes a sevenfold punishment for not doing what God said. And this period seems to be in view here in some way, right? Israel will be under other nations for many years yet, is what this seems to be talking about, culminating in Antiochus IV defiling the temple. The Maccabean revolution, again, will then fend off Antiochus and lead to the cleansing of the temple, okay? As far as the numbers go, okay, and there are many ways to interpret the numbers, and then you got the 70, and then you got there's 70 and... the 70 years in Jeremiah, then you got the 7 times 70, and how those things work together. Most scholars will say it's 490 years, which would put you in about that time frame. The people who are most confident about this, again, are those who probably have no idea what they're talking about, right? Because, again, you cannot be super confident about any of this because there's just no way. But because all of the rest of the prophecies and visions deal with Greece, it seems unlikely that this passage isn't also dealing with Greece. And again, if that's the case, it's dealing with Antiochus IV, who fits the references, right? And so we look at the prophecies and we assume that they must be, though, they just must be future yet, or they must be fulfilled soon, or whatever it may be, right? And why is that? And that's the problem, that's the argument, is it's like, well, it seems to fit Greece, but I don't know, I just feel in my heart that it's got something to do with future, the Antichrist, or something else, right? But note that the vast majority of Old Testament prophecies about nations and emperors and different, those things have already passed, and they've already been fulfilled by at least the New Testament times, right? If not in the Old Testament time. And so we look at this differently. We look at Daniel differently, and we say, well, wait a minute, but no, I still think it's future for some reason. And part of that is because it's used in the book of Revelation. And so because of those same themes and the beasts and all of that are used in Revelation, then many will say, well, wait a minute, because it's reused again in Revelation, those things in Daniel must also be future, right? Well, again, note that those things are used because the genre of apocalyptic literature uses those same images. If you read First Enoch, it also has those same types of images in it, right? And of course, we don't even see that as, inspired, right? And so again, they're not necessarily both talking about the same things, but they're in the same genre. And so they use the same images. And certainly John is looking back at Daniel. And if you go back and watch the Revelation videos, clearly John sees some of the stuff that happened in Daniel as being fulfilled in his time period as far as the tribulation and all of that, right? He sees the tribulation as happening right now in his time period, meaning in the first century. And so that's why he uses a lot of that same imagery. Okay, note that in Ezra and the return from exile, and we're going to end exactly on time. That's the craziest thing ever. Y'all are all probably going to go home and take medicine and go to bed, but still. Just note that the decree of King Cyrus allowing exiles to return home and worship their gods is direct fulfillment of what we talked about in Isaiah many moons ago, right? Those who had been exiled in Israel have conflict with those rebuilding the temple, and I think we get into that some more again this next week. So remember, you have those people who are imported into the land, and so now they live there. And remember, they had to get some priests to try to help them to worship Yahweh. And again, they would have just seen it as just one more God to worship, which in all fairness, the Israelites pretty much saw it that way too, up to this point. And so, there, when the temple starts getting built, you've got these basically pagans, and they're like, hey, we'll help you build the temple. And Jewish people are like, no thanks, we got this, And it's because they don't want their religion to be watered down, and which is what had happened. And so that's later on, that's what they say. And they're like, hey, you can't intermingle with these people, you can't marry these people, any of that. And I think that's probably this week's readings, right? Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.